Haven't lived until CNN trails you for 4 months with a camera. It was an amazing experience. By the way, that comment, it was short-lived. 12 years I pastored First Baptist Pearland. We got involved in politics through that school assembly and the outrage that ensued. By the way, I tape recorded that high school assembly, interrupted the speaker when she got over the line and began challenging some of her facts. And the following Sunday, I read the transcript word for word to our 3,000-member church. Now, you talk about some shocked little old ladies now. And I did tell them that we were going to use some words that we don't normally use. We gave opportunity for children to be dismissed. The place was overflowing. All the CEOs came. The Christmas, Easter only crowd. You know, the ones who were there to vote you in and vote you out. They never see them other than that. Well, I mean, people lying down the aisle, around the back. It was a packed audience that I spoke to that morning, including a Chronicle reporter that I didn't know was there, who'd gotten wind of all this. And that resulted in a nationwide media outcry. I wound up taking very few interviews. In fact, until after I spoke to the school board, none. But out of that, our people got involved in politics. We put 4 members out of 7 on the school board. We put 3 out of 5 on the city council and transformed the direction of that city, that community. And many of those folks are still involved in politics. Randy Weber, who last year was voted the most conservative state legislator, has gotten that award a couple of times now, but the most conservative, was my arch enemy in that city initially. He was on the wrong side of politics. And then our church began showing up at City Hall. We began running our candidates for office. It wasn't long, but one Sunday morning, he showed up at our church. Turned out his daughter had been coming to our youth group for about 6 months and loved our church. And Randy came and found out I wasn't a monster. And it wasn't long ago I baptized he and a couple of his sons into our fellowship. And today he's still a member of that church, and that's the rest of the story. One of my own secretary's husband was a rising young attorney, making big bucks at his age, comparatively, one of the largest firms in Houston. He left that career, became an assistant DA. He's now a sitting district court judge. In fact, he's in the only district court judge in that specter where he's the sitting judge that if a young lady wants to have an abortion without parental consent, she has to come to his court. Guess how many of them get through that experience? Because he's a soul-winning deacon. Folks, we saw God change the culture. We began networking pastors across Houston, and in one election cycle, 400 pastors working together in Harris County throughout 51 elected officials in Harris County who were left of center, radically left in some cases, targeted races, although we didn't call names, we didn't pass out any kind of information on who to vote for. We simply registered our people to vote, passed out voter guides, and had those preachers preaching 1 or 2 sermons on why Christians must vote their values, gave them the voter guides as they went into the polling places so they could circle who to vote for on their own. I did encourage the pastors to do what I did, and that's to stand at a given door on a couple of Sundays, and if people asked who I was voting for, I told them. Guess what? Our people don't know who I was voting for. Now, lay people don't typically have time to investigate candidates. They don't have the privilege of hearing a man like this. So they don't know who to vote for, and they'll go in and vote, you know, for somebody that just looks nice or they like the sound of their name. Well, the only thing worse than voting or not voting is voting wrong. I mean, it takes twice as many votes to beat that one. If you're going to vote wrong, just don't vote. But if you're going to vote, find out what the candidate believes and support them because you agree philosophically, and in our case, biblically. Well, our people began to get themselves involved, and our victories weren't short-lived because many of those folks are still involved in politics. What happened out of that, by the year 2002, wealthy laymen came to me and said, can you do what you did in Pearland and Harris County across Texas? And so I, at that point, hired a Christian consultant, a man that God is using all of this country to this hour. We laid out a $1.2 million budget, sat down with that layman. He wrote us a series of checks that came to more than $800,000. At that point, I resigned First Baptist Pearland after 12 years. We crisscrossed Texas, raised more than $1.2 million, And if your memory serves you correctly, that was the first election ever when the entire statewide office holders in this, every statewide office holder in this state for the first time was pro-life, pro-family, and the left never knew where that came from. Well, that came from 2,500 pastors signing a pledge to register their people to vote, pass out voter guides, which we provided for them, and then on election day, or the Sunday before the actual election, say, I've already early voted. Do as I do, not as I say. That makes all the difference. And there were so many Christians that went to the polls that election cycle that the entire slate of statewide office holders, for the first time since Reconstruction, by the way, you politicos can say Republican. I'm a preacher, so I tend away from that. But every statewide office in the state for the first time went Republican. But for us, it was pro-life, pro-family. That's what we preached on. At that point, I resigned the church, began traveling across this country, and in the year 2008, in every election cycle, we were in from 2 to 4 states, working where we knew there were Christian candidates like John Thune in South Dakota, like the senator from South Carolina, Jim DeMint. We were working in South Carolina the year that he got elected. In every state we worked in, the Christian candidates at the top of the ticket were elected, and the downline tickets all prospered and benefited when pastors got involved. It wasn't until 2008 that we got our clock cleaned. I mean, we got wiped out. And that's when I got so discouraged, I thought, man, God called me to pastor. Why don't I just settle in one place, quit all this traveling? And Lord, behold, you folks put me back on the road. That's the summation. I want to show you why I believe pastors ought to be involved. And if we're lucky and Fred's good, we've got a little slide presentation I want to show you. Hit the arrow up one time. Back it up. Okay, I want you to look at this first if you can see it. And if you can't, I'll read it to you. The earth is the fullness, or excuse me, the earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof, the world, and they that dwell therein. He hath founded it upon the seas, and established it upon the floods. Who shall ascend unto the hill of the Lord, and who shall stand in this holy place? He who has clean hands and a pure heart, who hath not lifted up his soul unto vanity, nor sworn deceitfully. He shall receive the blessings from the Lord. That, among other passages, is why we have got to find godly men and women with deep core values who, much like the gentleman who spoke tonight, can't be bought because they belong to someone and they understand they're accountable to that someone who far exceeds the most powerful lobby in Washington. No one else will do. No one else will stand against the weight of that environment called Washington, D.C., Austin, Texas, or even in your local city council where there's such pressure asserted on these men and women and so many promises made under the table to assure their next election. And by the way, the benefits are so good that good men sell their soul to keep them. We've got to have principled men. Click that button and we'll try to walk through this. Read this verse with me. Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. Next one. The wicked shall be turned into hell. Read that aloud with me. All the nations that forget God, including the United States of America. And beloved, we're on the edge of the abyss, leaning over. As certainly as that fireman reached out too far to get that baseball and perished, this nation is about to perish. Next slide. John Eulenberg. Ever heard of him? Yes. Lutheran minister. His father founded the Lutheran movement in America. He loved Jesus. He pastored a church along with his brother Frederick. When the war broke out, or when the rumors of the war broke out, he began preaching a very different kind of message. Next slide. Ecclesiastes 3:8. There is a time of war and a time of peace. Next. There's a time, he said, for all things, a time to preach and a time to pray. But there is also a time to fight. And that time has come now. Look at the next slide. He's standing there in front of 300 men plus their families. And he pulls off his clerical robe, and underneath is his uniform of a general in George Washington's army. He led 300 grown men out of that congregation to join General Washington and distinguished himself in war to such a degree. Next slide. Muhlenberg led his men in the battles of Morristown, Brandywine, Mammoth Courthouse, among other battles. If you go to Statuary Hall today, one of the most impressive things you'll see there on the Capitol grounds, where there are life-size statues, larger than life-size statues of the heroes of this country and its founding. And you'll find a preacher in that group by the name of Muhlenberg. His brother, by the way, castigated him for leaving the pulpit and going to fight the battle until his own church was burned to the ground by the British. He then enlisted and became the first Speaker of the House of Representatives in our nation's founding. Next slide. Pastor Jonas Clark. You see the church in the background? That's the church at Lexington where he was pastor. Lexington, Massachusetts. Here he is in his clerical wardrobe preparing to preach. Next slide. There he is in his military uniform. He fought in Washington's army. Next slide. Next slide. That's his church. I trained them for this very hour. Speaking of his men in his church, that they would fight and if need be, die too, under the shadow of the house of God. Next slide. Hit it again. Here's an artist's rendering of the battle that ensued in Lexington. That's his church in the background. Next slide. 49 colonists killed, 39 wounded. Next slide. The article in the paper says, bloody butchery by the British troops. Next slide. Jonas Clark, after the Battle of Lexington, said this, from this day will be dated the liberty of the world. Next slide. His sermon title on April 19, 1776 was, The Fate of Bloodthirsty Oppressors and God's Tender Care of His Distressed People. When is the last time you heard a sermon like that? That's what he preached to his people. Next slide. This is Jonathan Edwards. How many of you know who Jonathan Edwards was? He was the preacher who coined the famous sermon, or wrote the famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. His preaching, it was largely credited with the Great Awakening preceding the founding of this nation, putting courage in those colonists to stand up for true freedom. Next slide. One of my heroes of all time, George Whitefield, shook 2 continents with his preaching. You remember that old atheist by the name of Benjamin Franklin? A good friend of George Whitefield. In fact, we know that Whitefield preached to crowds of 40,000 on occasion because the scientist, Benjamin Franklin, was fascinated in his voice. And so while he was preaching, Franklin would stand at the podium and start walking, backing up until he could no longer audibly hear his voice. Then he would walk from side to side, give 18 inches a person, and tell us the size of the crowds. That old atheist by the name of Benjamin Franklin. Next slide. Samuel Cooper. Next slide. Pastor of Brattle Street Church in Boston, Massachusetts. Next slide. John Hancock and John Adams both attended and were members of his church. He was intimate friends with Samuel Adams and regularly corresponded with that old atheist, Benjamin Franklin. Next slide. Here are the colonists, a ragtag bunch if ever there was one. But I want to show you what their slogan was, what they cried as a battle cry. Next slide. We recognize no sovereign but God and no king but Jesus. Now, where did they get such a concept? Because of the pastors. Next slide. By the way, if I had a pointer, see that old atheist over on the side with his head in his hands? He called for that prayer meeting. He said if a sparrow cannot fly across the sky or fall to the earth without God's notice, are we so vain as to suppose that we can raise up a nation without His care? He said, men, we need to pray. And he told them about prayer meetings he'd been to in the past. And so they started praying. Next slide. By the way, John Witherspoon, the only preacher to sign the Declaration of Independence, is at the pulpit. Carpenter's Hall, September 7, 1774. They prayed and asked God to give guidance. Next slide. John Witherspoon was assigned to the Declaration of Independence. He was a minister and the president of Princeton, New Jersey College at the time. The number of presidents, vice presidents, Supreme Court justices, members of the House of Representatives, senators, this man influenced hundreds that made this nation the nation she is. He also was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Next slide. Prior to voting to sign the Declaration of Independence, a member had lamented, "We're not right for revolution." To which John Witherspoon replied, "Not right, sir. In my judgments, we are not only right, but unless some action is taken, we will be rotting." God give us preachers like that. Next slide. John Wesley, Methodist. Next slide. Jonathan Mayhew, a Congregationalist. Next slide. General James Scriven. I particularly like this one. Most Baptists, even in that era and in all eras, separation of church and state, don't get involved. In fact, that's where that phrase came from. Remember the correspondence between Danbury Baptist and Jefferson himself. But the reason I like General James Scriven is he was himself a Baptist minister. Next slide. Baptist pastor in Georgia. Keep going. Member of the Provincial Congress that met in Savannah on July 4th, 1775. Next. Joined the Colonial Army when the war broke out. Next. Colonel of the 3rd Battalion of the Georgia Continentals. Next. And on March 21st, 1778 was promoted to the rank of Brigadier General of the Georgia Militia by the Georgia Legislature. Next slide. While leading his men in battle in Midway, Georgia, November 22nd, 1778, he was shot once, got back on his horse. Shot twice, got back on his horse. Shot 3 times. They carried him from that place to the field hospital during the Battle of Spencer Hill. Next slide. He died on November 24th, 1778. Can you imagine the pain that he endured in those 2.5 days? Now here's the thing I want you to see. Next slide. There's the church that he pastored. It still stands, by the way. Next slide. And here in the cemetery adjacent, the stone marks the spot where repose the remains of Brigadier General James Scriven, in recognition of whose life and services the Congress of the United States has reared a monument in this cemetery. He was a gallant officer who, though but how old? 28 years of age at the time of his death, had attained the rank of Brigadier General. And you know what? Here we are, these hundreds of years later, and we're memorializing his memory. He lived 28 years. I want every man in this place, 28 years of age or older, to stand up. I know, so you'll still wait, by the way. What on earth are you doing, for heaven's sake, that 200 years from now someone might talk about? Think about what this man did. Is there a cause? Is there not a cause? I got here a little early and I drove down through some of these subdivisions and saw the palatial homes around this place. I just bought a new home, and so I called on one of them, $895,000. And it wasn't the nicest home on the block. You may be seated. Listen, that's great. I hope you live in that house. Has there ever been a nation God so blessed? God gave us this wonderful place. And to think that we're going to be the generation that sees it all go away. My daddy fought in the Korean War. My father-in-law, whom we recently put to rest, was shot, was blown out of a ship on his way to the Pacific Theater, where he was the only member of his troop that survived after days in the deep, being strafed by Japanese aircraft. Never spoke a word about it his whole life, until I asked him about 4 years before he died to at least help me understand a little bit about what he experienced. His hip was blown to pieces by one of those strafings. Should have died. Came back and spent time in a psychiatric hospital as a result of it. Went on and lived a healthy, good, honorable life. The greatest generation. The only thing Tom Brokaw's ever said I truly agreed with. But those men are dying now at the rate of 1,500 a day. And look at the generation taking their place. What a tragedy. What a tragic time we live in. Next, please. There's George Washington. Oh, I'll tell you, if you get your hands on 1776, an award-winning book by one of the most brilliant authors alive today, David McCullough. Read anything David McCullough's written. You can see, I don't know if he's a believer or not, but you can see his understanding of God all through his writings. I read 1776 and it made me weep to consider the price of our freedom and the glory of this man. Next slide. Here's how we think of George Washington. Riding through the snow, the year when freedom was so bleak and by everyone's standards lost. But a man of prayer. God, give us another president like that. Give us men and women like that. Next slide. James Garfield. He lived 100 days in office and was executed, assassinated on his 100th day in office. The thing I love about this man who died at such a young age. Next slide. Not only was he a politician, he was a preacher. And on February the 16th, he wrote his pastor, "Dear Brother Wallace, we have just closed our meeting with happy results. There were 34 additions, 31 by immersion." James A. Garfield. Boy, how far we've come to Barack Obama. Next slide. The greatest glory, by the way, I'm only called there are some godly career politicians. This man was President of the United States, 6th President. Then he went back to Congress and served almost until the time he died for one reason, to fight slavery. Went back year after year after year after year. His ministry and his life impacted Witherspoon and others that resulted in the end of slavery after his death. John Quincy Adams said this, "The greatest glory of the American Revolution was that it bound together in one indissoluble bond the principles of Christianity and the principles of civil government." Oh, that we could forever be mindful of that. Last slide. Excuse me. Let's look at this one. Say the words that are in yellow. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people to peacefully assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. Who can't make any laws regarding that? Congress. Next slide. Shall make no law. Does anybody here know what a law is? It's what you can or can't do according to Congress. Next slide. Prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Beloved, the chilling effect of Lyndon Baines Johnson, who wrote the law into the IRS code that said anyone with a 501c3 could not get involved in partisan politics, forever changing the landscape politically because, frankly, of the cowardice of the pulpit. But we need to be reminded of what that First Amendment says. That First Amendment says that a preacher can preach on anything he feels led of God to preach on. Do you know why that was so important? Well, having founded that Constitution, that document that is the heartbeat of this country, that's survived hundreds of other like documents from Western democracies that have come and gone in the 200 plus years that it's been in existence, that document before its approval was rejected by the colonies that said, oh, wait a second, we're not going to sign up for this federal set of laws until we have certain things in place, like the right to bear arms and other important things we call the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights. But at the top of all of them was the right to pursue God any way you felt led. Now, have you ever wondered why freedom of religion is connected to freedom of the press? Well, here's my theory. See how you like it. Those founders believed that a free pulpit would hold ungodly politicians accountable, that the pulpit would name the scoundrels and they wouldn't last very long. But if principled men couldn't be found, driven by their love of God and righteousness, then at least some ambitious reporter wanting a Pulitzer Prize or some other like kind of a recognition from his peers, at least the press would expose the infidelity to the Constitution. And you know what? That theory worked well until the last generation of preachers who bought into the church growth strategy that began to avoid anything that might be considered controversial. Like homosexuality. I mean, how many families haven't been impacted by such? Like abortion. 30% of the women in our churches or more have had at least one abortion. You know, if you begin to avoid any sin that somebody's sensitive about, you wind up without anything to preach on. And the message today coming from our pulpits, by and large, is, I'm okay, you're okay, we're okay, they're okay, and it's okay. And I submit to you, it is not okay. That we were called to be both salt and light. The light is a wonderful aspect. Everybody, boy, that coat, that look dirty to you? We moved this week, folks. I'm lucky to have a coat. Moved our family, my mother-in-law who's 86 who lives with us, and my parents who are 84 and 79 who live next door to us. We moved all of us from 100 acres to 4 acres where I could manage all of that. So you will forgive me if I digress. And pray for us as we get through this. We're down to the last few details. Mother and Daddy will move into their home by the weekend when the lights and the gas and the water is hooked up this week. But boy, this has been a tumultuous period of time for us. Now, what was I saying before I said all that? Oh, the coat was dirty.
Salt and light.
Yeah, let me take the dirty coat off. I wear that coat so you can't see how big my belly is. All right, now, folks, everybody loves the light part. You know, the light part is the pastor at time of death, standing there loving the congregation. The light part is standing by the bedside and praying and saying, you know, God's comfort is here. The light part is sharing the gospel and seeing a light come on in somebody's heart. That's what every pastor wants people to love him, and how better to be loved than to always be kind and sweet. But Jesus said, you're the light of the world and you're the salt of the earth. You see, the salt has a preservative quality to it. You can take meat and you can sprinkle salt on it and it will delay the decay. It won't stop the decay, but it delays the decay. But if the salt is removed, the decay is expedited. I submit to you that this world will decay. The Bible says that. Every nation does come to an end. The Bible is clear on that, especially those who forget God. But in the last generation, we've taken the salt off the table. We've put it in a salt shaker. We put it in the cabinet, and now the government is locking the cabinet door. And when that happens, the decay explodes, and we see it everywhere. We see rotting lives. We see families that are breaking down. We see more than half the babies in America born out of wedlock. We see people bragging about their sexual exploits, and we're surprised when Congressman Weiner is exposed. Now, folks, that was a tragedy, but it reveals that God has a sense of humor. What a name for the man. But what a reminder to anyone who believes that a secret life can be kept secret. Every life will be exposed, either in this world or the next, but it will be exposed. God's not looking for perfect people. He's looking for people who know they're sinners and need His help. And He's looking for a nation that sees its need and cries out for its help. I'm so proud of our governor, Rick Perry, for what he's doing on the 6th day of August. Set aside all politics. There have been several occasions when I wanted to wring his neck over issues that he took in the last 10 years. But I'll tell you what, for 10 years of governance, he's been as good a governor as this state has ever had. And now he's called for a day of Jesus prayers. And he's taking flack from around the world for that. There'll be no book signings. There'll be no sermons preached. Just prayer and praise for 12 hours. Water only. No speeches. I encourage all of you to get there and be a part of that. And I pray that the stadium will not only be filled but overflow, and that people be praying in 110-degree heat if necessary. Because the only hope for the nation is God. That's right. God is our greatest hope. Yep. He is also our greatest threat. Folks, next slide. Next slide. All it takes for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. Next slide. Charles Finney, the evangelist of the 1800s, who's credited with the Second Great Awakening. By the way, he was an attorney studying Blackstone's commentary on the law, so filled with Scripture that his soul was converted, and he left the legal profession and became America's greatest evangelist of his era. Next slide. If there is a decay of conscience, read the next phrase, the pulpit is responsible for it. If the public press lacks moral discernment, say it, the pulpit is responsible for it. If the church is degenerate and worldly, the pulpit is responsible for it. If the world loses its interest in Christianity, the pulpit is responsible for it. If Satan rules in our halls of legislation, the pulpit is responsible for it. If our politics become so corrupt that the very foundations of our government are ready to fall away, the pulpit is responsible for it. We'll stop it there. You cut it off. Folks,